Hello manager, at the start of my career I ran a project that was infested with the risks. It was a real struggle, so I decided to improve my risk identification knowledge and skills for the next project. But I quickly discovered that information on the internet and in the PMBOK guide was useless. That's why I decided to test it all out and develop my own practical approach. Let me share all my findings with you so you can save time googling different bits and pieces of information about risk identification. So what is risk identification in the first place? Risk identification is an effort to discover threats and opportunities that may impact a project, its feasibility, or its management plan. So in essence, you can use whatever works for you in your company. There are no hard rules here. On the contrary, good risk identification comes from communication and collaboration with all project stakeholders, not from rigid processes and tools. So what do we try to identify here? We want to discover all possible events or conditions that may potentially affect our project in a negative way. It's a definition of a risk. The only important thing here is that a risk have a probability to occur. So you need to ensure that you treat events that will happen for sure as facts, not as risks. Therefore, you will plan them right from the beginning. Next, I had to overcome the confusion of when do you perform risk identification? And here's the main problem. In theory, you have processes and tools that you apply at specific points of the project. However, in practice, 80% of time you need to identify risks continuously. This means that you should talk through possible risks for each and every activity during the project. For example, when you collect requirements and write specifications, you and your team should always be on the lookout for risks. When you implement a piece of a project work, you talk about possible risks as well. But yes, that's not enough. In the remaining 20% of cases, you do need in-depth risk identification sessions, where you take a broader look at the project as a whole. For example, here are some important moments at which to consider these dedicated risk identification sessions. When clients identify the project goal, after you identify key stakeholders, when you have reviewed risk categories for the first time, after you collected most of the requirements, after you created a draft of the work breakdown structure, WBS, after you identified the required project resources, after you have drafted the project schedule, and after you have drafted the project budget. Okay, but how do we actually identify a risk? Well, we use a risk identification technique, which is an approach to discovering threats that you are unaware of by collaborating with other project stakeholders. As I said, you can use whatever works for you in your environment. Personally, I tested lots of techniques and tools, however, I use only the following 7 techniques in practice. First of all, talking about risks. It's not a real technique, but I'll explain it in a minute, so stick with me. Then we have checklists or risk categories. Document analysis, root cause analysis, assumptions analysis, dedicated brainstorming, and dedicated interviews. Okay, the next confusing moment, for me at least, was to understand which technique to use on which activity or document. Good news, you have some space for creativity here. You see, some techniques like brainstorming are universal, you can apply them to anything on a project. Other techniques like requirements analysis are specific to a piece of project documentation, the requirements, and you do it once per piece of these requirements. So to sum it up, you don't have to use all the techniques on everything. However, you might apply several techniques to one piece of information. For example, you can review the project schedule with the team and brainstorm possible threats. After that, you'll check common risk sources in their risk categories. Then you'll take the schedule to a senior project manager and interview her to get her insights. Notice how we used 4 different techniques on one and the same piece of project documentation. Of course, not all artifacts require so much attention. However, for example, I recommend putting more efforts into project budget and schedule. And overall, it boils down to efficiently using your time and resources. Keep in mind that resource management is not free of charge. You use your time and resources from your project. Okay, now let me give you some real-life examples, but before moving on, please hit the like button. You will help me reach more project managers who need this information. By the way, the key in risk identification is to keep things simple. Your team members and stakeholders should be able to use these techniques without special training or experience. And remember, they identify majority of risks, not you. As I said, in the real world, we continuously identify risks. It's the most effective approach. We do it by talking about risks, but it's not a casual conversation. It has specific rules and agreements. Again, that's why you need to educate all team members and stakeholders in your risk management process. In essence, you need to ensure that everyone has the same understanding of the following: importance of risk management, responsibility of each person in the risk management process, what is a risk and what is a fact. And also, how do we capture risks in the risk register? How do we handle risks in general? It will ensure that you use the same terminology and mean the same things when talking about project risks. That's why when you have a shared vision of risk management process, you can incorporate risk identification in every project activity. For example, you can ask something along the lines of: do you see any risks here? How risky is this approach? Please provide a list of risks along with estimation. Let's think about possible risks. What may go wrong with this plan? So let me repeat this, it's critical. All the next techniques will have sporadic or one-time appearances. However, this talking about risks technique happens continuously. The next most efficient technique is the analysis of risk categories. This technique is inspired by collecting lessons learned process. But let me explain it. You see, most organizations carry out projects of similar nature. Processes and policies are the same. Some stakeholders never change. So a new project inherits all the same sources of risk from the environment. And risk categories are just a list of those common sources of risks of your organization. The list of risk categories comes from lessons learned in risk management. Ideally, all project managers should share these lessons learned with others. However, that's rarely the case. But I've got you covered. I'll share a link to my list of categories in the description below this video. Okay, and the process is quite simple. You need to get through the list to identify risks that may apply to your current project. And you can approach this in different ways. You may review the list alone and shortlist the categories, then discuss this list with your team. Or you can brainstorm through the whole list with your team. In any case, I learned that the best time to do this analysis is when you already know the project scope of work. But also, I recommend keeping the list close at hand as a cheat sheet or a template for other risk identification sessions. It will be a great icebreaker for your team members to start brainstorming risks. Let's move to project documentation analysis. And first, it has an important subset, the analysis of requirements. I want to focus on it separately because it's critical. Requirements contain significant risks for a project, therefore you need to analyze them to find any ambiguity or unclear aspects. Poor requirements is the #1 cause of project failure. However, it's not only about their quality and level of detail. It's also important to have enough time to analyze all the project specifications and requirements. You need to have a chance to review and discuss each piece of requirement with the team and with the big picture of the project in mind. Also, you need to ensure that requirements don't conflict with one another. And not giving yourself the time to do all of these activities is a risk in itself. So here's what you need to do in practice. Select a piece of requirements like a user story or a specification. Then select a group to analyze it. It's either the whole team or just group leaders. And then let them read through specifications and review designs. After that, plan a meeting to analyze requirements. Let one person explain the requirements to the others and clarify requirements to the point where everyone has the same understanding. If you have never done this before, try it at least once, even if just out of curiosity. You will notice that different people read the same words and sentences differently. Next, we can review and analyze any other documentation on the project. This is the more general part of reviewing project documentation. So, what documents should you actually review to find risks? And the answer is every single one of them. For example, once you have a first draft of the project management plan, review it with your team. You see, your team is the primary source of information and risks. When you walk the whole team through the whole project management plan, I can promise that each person will find at least one risk related to them. And it's better to find out such risk early on and adjust the plan accordingly. And in fact, there are many aspects that you need to talk about with the team. But at the very least, you need to discuss the following. First, units of measurements, then did they provide estimates in effective or ideal hours, working days, and so on. What did they actually include in those estimates? Is there a buffer? Also, do they know how to report the money they spend? Do they know how to log their progress and when? After that, do they know your project management approach in general? What about risk management? Do they understand the definition of a completed task? As you can imagine, the list goes on and on. Never assume that team members see and understand your plan in the same way as you do. But moreover, don't assume that all team members have a common understanding of all project activities that you expect them to do. Next, for example, once I have a draft of a schedule, I show it to the team. They review dependencies, the flow of tasks, and any buffers that they may need. They also think through their personal plans, vacations, and other errands. So, for example, a team member sees the project schedule. He has several critical tasks next week assigned to him. Then he suddenly remembers that he is planning an important trip he hasn't told you about yet. As a result, good that you learned about it, you can now adjust the schedule to allow for his absence. Also, different parts of your project may depend on each other, and you want to make sure that nothing blocks your progress throughout the whole project. So again, team members may discover hard dependencies that you have missed. Therefore, it helps you to correct the plan early on and include these possible delays. Now let's talk about dedicated brainstorming and interview sessions. Alright, in general, I don't like to identify a risk with wild brainstorming. However, there are critical points in project planning when I do use brainstorming for risk identification on deeper level. So, for example, I use brainstorming when analyzing essential requirements, while reviewing the WBS, when reviewing the schedule and human resource plan, while creating a quality management plan, and before finalizing the whole project management plan. So, for example, once I have a draft of the WBS, I plan several brainstorming sessions. Then I analyze major deliverables one by one with the team. My main question is, what could go wrong when we implement this piece of the project? And I point at one of the deliverables. Then I say, what challenges do you see in putting it all together in one piece? So as you can see, we take broader look at our future work once we know enough details about it. I use interviews with subject matter experts in the same manner, but unfortunately, these experts usually don't have time to participate in all risk management activities. So instead, I try to get feedback and validation on the most critical risks and related risk response plans. From time to time, I also use the root cause analysis for identification of systematic risks. For example, I used it several times when I analyzed severe problems with a past project, when I tried to solve a systematic problem with stakeholders. This usually relates to inefficient communications, poor quality, inaccurate estimates, or ambiguity in requirements. Likewise, I try to group all identified risks by their root cause. It helps to see the primary source of problems and identify even more risks. So in a real-world project, you don't carry out root cause analysis during planning or execution. Usually it's a post-mortem or analysis after a significant problem. So it works like this. First you collect lessons learned, then you allocate time at the end of the project for the root cause analysis sessions, and later you develop a systematic response plans for the next project. Okay, next technique is huge and difficult. It requires serious discipline from your end, and I'm talking about analysis of assumptions. By nature, assumptions involve risks. If an assumption is wrong, a project is in trouble. So, first of all, you do need to keep track of all major assumptions. I keep separate lists for project level assumptions, and in addition I log all assumptions related to specific requirements right in the specification. After that you need to review and validate the assumptions regularly. Keep in mind that we make assumptions all the time, but most are made right at the start of the project, so they may impact the project later down the road. You need to work hard to validate an assumption and either make it a fact or transform it into a known risk. Here's the truth. I still use the same risk identification techniques. It made me a better project manager back then. Moreover, it works the same way for small projects and large projects. But now the main challenge for you is what to do next with all these risks. How to use this information to finish a project on time and within budget. So if you are asking the same questions, you need to watch this video next. It's a full tutorial on project management and it will explain how it works as a system. Click on the video now, I'm waiting for you there.